Chapter 1. Inheriting the Mysterious Shop. The brass key felt heavier than it should have, its ornate scrollwork catching the morning light as Celeste turned it over in her palm. 3 weeks had passed since Grandfather Boswith's funeral, and still she carried the weight of his absence like a stone in her chest. The key to his clock shop, now her clock shop, seemed to pulse with its own quiet rhythm, as if counting down the moments until she found the courage to cross the threshold. Standing before the narrow storefront on Pendulum Lane, Celeste drew a steadying breath that misted in the October air. The painted sign above the door had faded to a whisper of its former deep blue. Boswith and Company. Fine timepieces established 1847. Ivy had begun to claim the corners of the mullioned windows, and the brass nameplate bore the green patina of seasons. Yet, despite its weathered appearance, something about the shop seemed to hum with patient energy, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting. The key slid into the lock with a soft sigh of recognition. The mechanism turned with surprising ease, clicking once, twice. Then the door swung open on hinges that whispered rather than creaked. A cascade of sound greeted her. The gentle tick-tock-tick that was the heartbeat of 100 sleeping timepieces, punctuated by the deeper, resonant chime of a grandfather clock marking the half-hour somewhere in the shop's depths. Celeste stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with the soft finality of a book cover settling shut. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows and gleaming brass, where shafts of dusty sunlight fell through the windows to illuminate islands of wonder. Clocks stood sentinel on every surface. Mantelpieces lined the walls like altarpieces, each bearing its own collection of timepieces. Bracket clocks perched on wooden shelves like dignified owls. Delicate carriage clocks sat in glass cases, their Roman numerals crisp as fresh calligraphy. And rising from the floor like ancient trees were the grandfather clocks, their pendulums swinging in a hypnotic symphony of motion. The air itself seemed thick with time, heavy with the accumulated minutes and hours that had passed through this place. Celeste could smell beeswax and metal polish, the faint sweetness of old wood, and something else, something that reminded her of winter mornings and her grandfather's worn wool coat. She moved deeper into the shop, her footsteps muffled by a Persian rug that had seen decades of customers' shoes. Her fingers trailed along the edge of a mahogany display case, coming to rest on a small brass placard that read repairs in her grandfather's careful script. How many times had she stood on the other side of this very case as a child, watching his patient hands coax broken timepieces back to life. His fingers had moved with the precision of a surgeon and the gentleness of a gardener, each gesture deliberate yet flowing. Every clock has a soul, little Celeste, his voice seemed to whisper through the memory, and every soul keeps its own time. She had thought it was merely the eccentric poetry of an old clockmaker then. Now surrounded by his life's work, she wondered if perhaps he had meant something more literal. The workshop lay behind a curtained doorway, and Celeste pushed through into the familiar sanctuary of her grandfather's craft. The workbench stood exactly as he had left it, tools arranged with military precision, a half-assembled movement frozen mid-repair. His magnifying glass still held a gear between its lenses, as if he had merely stepped away for tea and would return at any moment. But it was what hung on the wall above the bench that made Celeste's breath catch. A large oil painting dominated illuminated the space, its frame carved from the same dark wood as the grandfather clocks. The portrait showed a young woman with Celeste's own dark hair and serious eyes, standing beside a tall man whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Grandfather Bosworth in his youth. The woman wore a cream-coloured dress with tiny pearl buttons, and her hand rested on the pendulum of an extraordinary clock, one that seemed to pulse with inner light even in the painted representation. Celeste had never seen this portrait before, had never heard mention of the woman who looked so much like her. She approached the painting with careful steps, as if sudden movement might cause it to dissolve like a mirage. A small brass plate at the bottom of the frame bore an inscription in flowing script: Evangeline Bosworth, 1923, the first keeper of time. The first keeper, Celeste murmured, the words feeling strange and significant on her tongue. A soft chime drew her attention back to the shop proper, where she discovered something that made her pulse quicken. One of the grandfather clocks, a magnificent piece with a moon-phase dial and silver pendulum, was chiming the hour. But according to the pocket watch she wore on a chain around her neck, an heirloom from her grandmother, it was only 10:30. The grandfather clock's hands pointed to 11. As she watched, mesmerized, other timepieces began to join the discordant chorus. A mantel clock with cherub faces chimed what sounded like 3 o'clock. A delicate French clock with a porcelain face sang out 5 silvery notes. A cuckoo clock burst open to release its wooden bird, which called 7 times before retreating. None of them agreed with each other, and none matched the true time. Yet there was something oddly harmonious about the chaos of chimes, like a jazz ensemble where each instrument played its own melody but somehow created a greater whole. Celeste found herself listening not to individual clocks, but to the conversation between them, a dialogue conducted in brass and silver, in the sweet soprano of small bells and the deep bass of ancient gongs. The cacophony gradually subsided, leaving only the gentle ticking that was the shop's constant heartbeat. But now Celeste noticed something else. Some of the clocks were ticking in perfect unison, while others maintained their own rhythms. The effect was like rain on a roof, or footsteps on cobblestones, or the gentle chaos of leaves rustling in wind. She approached one of the synchronized clocks, a delicate piece with an enameled face depicting a pastoral scene. As she drew near, the ticking seemed to grow more distinct, more personal, and then, impossible though it seemed, she heard something else beneath the mechanical rhythm. A whisper, so soft it might have been her imagination. "Welcome home, little keeper." Celeste stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around the shop with new eyes, suddenly aware of the weight of unseen gazes. Were the clocks watching her? The question felt absurd even as it formed in her mind, yet she couldn't shake the sensation that she had stepped into something far larger and stranger than a simple inheritance. In the growing afternoon light, dust motes danced like tiny spirits through the air, and the symphony of ticking took on new dimensions. Some rhythms were quick and bright like the patter of small animals. Others were slow and stately, marking time with the patience of mountains, and threading through it all was something that sounded almost like breathing. The inhale and exhale of a vast, sleeping consciousness. Celeste made her way to the shop's main counter, where the daybook lay open to the last entry in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The date was 3 weeks ago, the day before his passing. The entry was brief and puzzling. The backward clock grows stronger. Celeste must be ready. Time itself depends on the next keeper understanding what I could not. The words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the old windows. What backward clock? And what was she supposed to understand? She flipped through the preceding pages, finding entries that grew increasingly cryptic. Mrs. Pemberton's carriage clock finished, but it showed her wedding day instead of the current hour. The anniversary clock in the west corner has begun chiming for moments that haven't happened yet. Found Evangeline's journal in the cellar. The pattern is repeating. God help us all. A journal. Heart-pounding, Celeste made her way to the narrow stairs that led to the cellar. Each step down seemed to take her deeper, not just into the building, but into layers of mystery that had accumulated like sediment over the decades. The cellar smelled of old stone and metal, and the darkness seemed to press against her like velvet. Her fingers found the light switch, and amber illumination revealed a space that served as both storage and archive. Clockwork components filled orderly shelves, while finished pieces awaited their turn in the shop above. But in the corner, beneath a cloth cover, stood something that made Celeste's breath catch. It was a clock unlike any in the shop above. Tall as a man but impossibly delicate, its case carved from what looked like crystallized moonlight. The pendulum hung motionless, and the hands pointed in directions that defied geometry. And most unnervingly of all, the numbers on its face ran counterclockwise. 12 at the bottom, 6 at the top. Even from across the room, she could feel its presence like a cold draft against her skin. This had to be the backward clock her grandfather had written about, and something was definitely wrong with it. The air around it shimmered with an oily iridescence, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Beside the clock, she found what she was looking for, a leather-bound journal bearing the name Evangeline Boswith in faded gold lettering. Celeste opened it with trembling fingers and read the first entry. March 1st, 1923. Today I have become the keeper of time, as my father was before me, and his father before him. The clocks have accepted me, and I begin to understand why our family was chosen for this sacred trust. Time is not the steady river most people believe it to be. It is an ocean with currents and tides, with deep places where strange things swim, and sometimes the ocean needs tending. The journal slipped from Celeste's numb fingers as the truth began to dawn. Her inheritance was not simply a shop full of beautiful timepieces. It was a responsibility that stretched back generations, a calling she had never imagined. Above her, the clocks continued their eternal conversation, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that suddenly seemed less like chaos and more like a language she was only beginning to learn. And in that language, she heard a clear message. Time itself was in danger, and she was the only one who could save it. The key in her pocket pulsed once, warm against her palm, as if sealing a covenant she was only now beginning to understand. Chapter 2. Discovering each clock's power. Celeste spent the night in the small apartment above the shop, surrounded by Evangeline's journals and the constant, comforting tick of 100 timepieces. Sleep came in fragments, moments of rest punctuated by dreams where clock hands moved like dancers, and silver voices whispered secrets just beyond comprehension. When dawn finally pressed its pale fingers against the workshop windows, she felt as though she had traversed years rather than hours. The morning light transformed the shop into something almost sacred. Golden dust motes spiraled through the air like tiny galaxies, and each clock face seemed to hold its own miniature sun. Celeste stood at the top of the stairs, coffee growing cold in her hands, and listened to the symphony that had become the soundtrack of her new existence. But now, armed with fragments of understanding gleaned from Evangeline's careful script, she heard the music differently. Each tick was a heartbeat, each chime was a voice, and each clock, she was beginning to suspect, held its own unique relationship with time itself. The revelation should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself drawn deeper into the mystery with a pull as inexorable as gravity. Her grandfather had prepared her for this moment, she realized now. All those childhood afternoons spent in the shop, all his stories about the personalities of different timepieces, all his gentle insistence that she learn to listen with more than her ears, it had all been preparation for what Evangeline called the awakening. According to the journals, each new keeper experienced it differently. Some heard music, others saw colours that had no names. A few could smell the passage of seasons in the brass and silver. But all of them eventually learned to perceive what Evangeline called the true nature of the guardians. Celeste set down her coffee and approached the first clock that had spoken to her the day before, the delicate piece with the enamelled pastoral scene. In the morning light, she could see details that had escaped her notice. The tiny sheep in the painted meadow seemed to have moved slightly, and the shepherd's staff pointed in a different direction than she remembered. She placed her palm against the clock's wooden case and closed her eyes, trying to quiet her mind the way her grandfather had taught her when listening for the problems in a broken mechanism. At first, she heard only the steady tick-tock that was beginning to feel as natural as her own pulse. Then gradually, something more emerged. Images flickered behind her eyelids, a sun-drenched field where wheat swayed in a breeze that smelled of summer afternoons and distant rain. Children's laughter echoed across the meadow, high and wild and free. A young woman in a blue dress spun with her arms outstretched, her face turned toward cloudless sky, while somewhere a church bell tolled the hour in lazy bronze notes. Celeste's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. The clock face showed the same pastoral scene, but now she understood it wasn't merely decoration. It was a window, a preserved moment of perfect joy that the clock held like a treasure, ready to share with anyone who knew how to listen. "The memory keepers," she whispered, remembering Evangeline's term from the journals. These clocks preserved moments of pure emotion, capturing them like pressed flowers between the pages of time. Emboldened, she moved to the mantel clock with cherub faces that had chimed out of sequence the day before. This piece was older than the pastoral clock, its brass darkened with age, and its carved angels bearing expressions of beatific serenity. When Celeste touched its surface, she was prepared for the vision that washed over her. A cathedral, vast and echoing, where afternoon light streamed through stained glass to paint the floor in jeweled patterns. The air thrummed with voices raised in harmony. Hundreds of souls joined in a hymn that seemed to lift the very stones of the ancient building. Peace settled over her like a benediction. so profound and complete that tears sprang to her eyes. Here was faith made manifest, hope given voice, the human spirit reaching towards something magnificent and eternal. When the vision faded, Celeste found herself trembling. The emotions carried by these clocks weren't merely preserved, they were transmitted, shared with perfect clarity across decades or even centuries. She was experiencing moments of transcendence captured by the timepieces like light in amber. The French clock with its porcelain face called to her next. This one was smaller than the others, delicate as spun sugar, its case painted with roses that seemed to bloom even as she watched. Her touch brought a flood of sensation so intense she gasped aloud. A ballroom swirled with dancing couples, their jewellery catching the light of crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the perfume of hothouse flowers and the rustle of silk against silk. Music flowed like wine, and young hearts beat in rhythm with the waltz. But beneath the gaiety ran undercurrents of longing, stolen glances between partners who belonged to others, promises whispered behind fans, love that bloomed in the space between one dance and the next. This clock, Celeste realized, specialized in matters of the heart. Every tick held a flotation, every chime an echo of passion both fulfilled and forever yearning. She moved through the shop methodically now, her confidence growing with each revelation. The cuckoo clock that had called 7 times held memories of dawn, that magical hour when night surrendered to day, and the world held its breath in anticipation. When she touched its carved wooden case, she found herself standing in a dozen different gardens, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of rose and gold. A ship's chronometer, brass and businesslike in its presentation, carried the vast loneliness of ocean crossings, the sound of wind in rigging, the creak of wooden hulls, the whispered prayers of sailors far from home. A bracket clock with astronomical displays held the wonder of stargazing, its memories suffused with the vertigo of contemplating infinite space and humanity's small place within it. But it was the grandfather clocks that proved most complex. These towering sentinels didn't hold single moments, but entire narratives, stories that unfolded across their faces like slowly turning kaleidoscopes. The first one she approached, the magnificent piece with the moon phase dial, contained the story of a marriage that had lasted 70 years. She watched the couple age frame by frame, their love deepening and evolving through seasons of joy and sorrow, until death finally claimed the husband and the wife was left to tend their shared memories alone. Another grandfather clock held the chronicle of a family line, generations passing like a time-lapse film, children becoming parents, becoming grandparents, all watched over by this steadfast guardian who measured their days with patient devotion. The names changed, the faces evolved, but the love that bound them together remained constant as the clock's steady heartbeat. Remarkable, isn't it? The voice, paper dry but warm with affection, made Celeste spin around. An elderly woman stood in the shop's entrance, her white hair pinned beneath a hat that had seen better decades. She wore a wool coat despite the morning's mildness, and her eyes, the pale blue of winter sky, held depths that spoke of accumulated wisdom. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in," Celeste said, trying to compose herself after the intensity of the clock-induced visions. "The shop isn't really open yet. I'm still getting oriented." The woman smiled, and the expression transformed her lined face into something almost girlish. "Oh, my dear, I know exactly who you are. You're little Celeste, all grown up and come into her inheritance at last. I'm Mrs. Willoughby, Adelaide Willoughby. I was a great friend of your grandfather's. May he rest in peace." The name stirred recognition. Mrs. Willoughby had been mentioned in both Evangeline's journals and her grandfather's recent entries, though always in cryptic terms that Celeste hadn't fully understood. Now, seeing the woman in person, she sensed something familiar about her, a quality that reminded her of the clocks themselves. "Mrs. Willoughby," Celeste repeated. "Yes, grandfather mentioned you. Please come in. I was just learning about the collection." Adelaide's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. Learning about them, or learning from them. There's a significant difference, you know. She moved through the shop with the confidence of long familiarity, her gloved hand trailing along the edge of display cases. "Your grandfather told me this day would come eventually. The clocks have been waiting for you to truly see them." "You know about what they do?" Celeste asked, relief flooding through her. "About the memories and visions. Know about it." Adelaide laughed, a sound like silver bells. "My dear child, I've been part of it for longer than you might imagine. Here, let me show you something special." She led Celeste to a corner of the shop where a small collection of clocks sat slightly apart from the others. These timepieces had a different quality. Their cases were simpler, their ornamentation less elaborate, but they seemed to pulse with concentrated energy. "The active ones," Adelaide explained, using another of Evangeline's terms. "These don't just hold memories, they shape time itself." She gestured to a plain brass carriage clock. "That one can slow the passage of hours, making a single afternoon stretch into a week of subjective time. Useful when you need extra moments to solve a difficult problem." Next to it sat a wooden mantel clock with a face of deep blue enamel. "This beauty can accelerate healing," Adelaide continued, "not by magic precisely, but by allowing the body to experience a year of recovery in the span of a few hours. Your grandfather used it often when the arthritis in his hands became too painful for delicate work." Celeste stared at the clocks with new understanding. They weren't just repositories of temporal experience, they were tools. Instruments that could manipulate time itself in small but significant ways. The weight of responsibility she had felt the day before multiplied exponentially. "And this one," Adelaide said, approaching a clock that made Celeste's skin prickle with unease, "is why I've come to see you today." It was an ornate mantel clock with a case of blackened silver, its face marked with symbols rather than numbers. The hands moved in stuttering jerks, as if struggling against some invisible resistance. Even from several feet away, Celeste could feel wrongness radiating from it like heat from a fever. "The temporal anchor," Adelaide said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's supposed to keep the local flow of time stable, preventing paradoxes and chronological drift. But something's gone wrong with it. Can you feel it?" Celeste nodded, not trusting her voice. The sensation emanating from the clock was like fingernails on slate, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the taste of copper pennies and old fear. "It started about 3 months ago," Adelaide continued. "Small things at first. Clocks running differently throughout the town, people finding themselves confused about what day it was, memories feeling unstable. But it's getting worse." Yesterday I woke up and couldn't remember my late husband's face. 40 years of marriage, and his features had just vanished from my mind. The pain in her voice made Celeste's heart clench. She thought of the cryptic entries in her grandfather's daybook, the growing concern evident in his final weeks. He knew, she said quietly. Grandfather knew something was wrong. He suspected the problem was connected to the backward clock in the cellar, Adelaide said, but he died before he could investigate fully. That's why the clocks called you home, dear one. That's why they revealed their nature to you so quickly. Time is running out, quite literally. As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted up from the cellar, a low, discordant chime that seemed to harmonize with nothing. The active clocks around them shuddered in response, their ticking becoming irregular and anxious. Even the peaceful memory keepers seemed agitated, their gentle rhythms quickening like heartbeats under stress. The connection is growing stronger, Adelaide observed, her weathered hands clutching her purse. Soon it will affect not just local time but the memories of everyone in town, and if it spreads beyond the town boundaries. She shuddered. Evangeline's journals spoke of such a catastrophe during the Great War. Entire regions where time ran backward, where people aged in reverse until they simply faded away. The keepers of that era barely managed to contain it. Celeste felt the weight of generations settling on her shoulders. The beautiful, mysterious inheritance she had discovered was also a burden of cosmic proportions. Lives, perhaps thousands of lives, depended on her understanding and mastering abilities she barely comprehended. But as she looked around the shop at the clocks that had revealed their secrets to her, as she felt their patient presence like benedictions in brass and silver, she found her resolve strengthening. Her grandfather had prepared her for this, whether she had known it or not. Her bloodline had carried this responsibility for centuries, and the clocks themselves, these guardians of time's deepest mysteries, would guide her if she learned to truly listen. Another discordant chime rose from the cellar, stronger this time, and several of the shop clocks answered with defensive harmonies. A conversation was happening in the language of time itself, and Celeste was beginning to understand that she stood at the center of it all. The keeper of time, the guardian of memory itself. The weight of the title pressed against her chest like a physical thing. But beneath the pressure, she felt something else stirring. The same calling that had drawn her to mend broken things since childhood, now magnified and given cosmic purpose. The clocks were waiting. Time itself was counting on her. And somewhere in the depths of the shop, the backward clock continued its malevolent work, slowly unraveling the careful tapestry of moments and memories that made existence itself possible. Celeste looked at Mrs. Willoughby, then at the anxious timepieces surrounding them. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. "Tell me what grandfather couldn't finish. It's time I learned what it truly means to be a keeper." Chapter 3. The backwards clock's growing influence. The descent into the cellar felt like a journey into the heart of a dying star. Each step down the narrow wooden stairs carried Celeste deeper into an atmosphere that grew thicker and more oppressive with every breath. The air itself seemed to resist her passage, pressing against her skin with the weight of accumulated wrongness. Behind her, Mrs. Willoughby's measured footsteps provided a comforting counterpoint to the increasingly erratic symphony emanating from the shop above. The backward clock stood exactly where Celeste had left it the previous day, but its presence had grown more pronounced, more aggressive. The crystalline case that had seemed beautiful in yesterday's amber light now pulsed with an oily iridescence that made her eyes water. The pendulum, which had hung motionless before, now swayed in a rhythm that defied physics, moving without the steady precision of normal timepieces, but in stuttering, unpredictable arcs that seemed to mock the very concept of measured time. "Dear God," Mrs. Willoughby whispered, her voice barely audible above the clock's discordant humming. "It's grown so much stronger since yesterday. Can you feel it?" Celeste could indeed feel it, a sensation like standing too close to a waterfall, where the force of rushing water creates pressure waves that vibrate through bone and sinew. But this was worse, because what rushed past wasn't water, but time itself, flowing backward through the clock's mechanisms in a torrent that threatened to drag everything else along with it. The numbers on the clock face had shifted since her last visit. Where before they had merely run counterclockwise, now they seemed to writhe like living things, occasionally vanishing entirely before reappearing in different positions. The hands moved in ways that hurt to watch, sometimes backward, sometimes in spirals, occasionally jumping from one position to another without crossing the intervening space. Evangeline's journals describe this, Mrs. Willoughby said, pulling a small leather notebook from her coat pocket. Her own handwriting filled the pages, decades of observations recorded in her role as unofficial chronicler of the shop's mysteries. She called it temporal corruption, when a timepiece becomes infected with paradox and begins to spread chronological instability. Celeste approached the clock cautiously, aware that each step brought her closer to something fundamentally dangerous. The wrongness radiating from it made her skin crawl, but underneath the revulsion she felt something else, a deep professional curiosity. This was still a timepiece after all. Somewhere beneath the corruption lay the original mechanism, the careful arrangement of gears and springs that her grandfather had taught her to understand and repair. "What caused it?" she asked, circling the clock at a careful distance. "Was it damaged somehow?" Mrs. Willoughby consulted her notebook, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. According to Evangeline, these devices were created during what she called the Great Binding, a ritual performed by the first keepers to stabilize time itself after some prehistoric catastrophe. But they're unnatural things, holding forces that weren't meant to be contained. Sometimes the binding weakens. As if responding to their conversation, the clock chimed, a sound like breaking glass reversed, like screams played backward, like the universe itself crying out in pain. The note hung in the air long past any normal chime's duration, growing stronger rather than fading. Around them, the temperature dropped precipitously, and frost began forming on the stone walls in patterns that resembled clock faces. "It's getting worse," Celeste observed, her breath now visible in the suddenly frigid air. The influence is spreading faster. From above came the sound of the shop clocks responding to their corrupted siblings' call. But their usual harmonious conversation had become something closer to panic. Rapid ticking that sounded like metallic rain, chimes that clashed in desperate discord, the anguished protest of temporal guardians watching their fundamental purpose being perverted. Mrs. Willoughby pressed closer to Celeste, seeking warmth and comfort. Your grandfather tried to contain it by surrounding the clock with protective barriers, consecrated silver, blessed oils, symbols of temporal stability. But the corruption is too strong. It's beginning to affect the town itself. As if summoned by her words, new sounds began filtering down from the street above, confused voices, the honking of car horns in no apparent pattern, the distant wail of what might have been sirens. The temporal disturbance was no longer contained to the shop. "Show me," Celeste said quietly. "I need to see the extent of the damage." They climbed back to the shop's main floor, where the morning light revealed scenes that would have been absurd if they weren't so deeply unsettling. Through the windows, Celeste could see pedestrians moving with odd, jerky motions, some walking backward without apparent awareness, others aging and de-aging in visible cycles that lasted only seconds. A delivery truck sat motionless in the middle of the street while its driver stared at the steering wheel in obvious confusion, as if he couldn't remember how he had come to be there. The shop's clocks had arranged themselves into defensive formations, their sounds creating barriers of proper time around islands of stability. The memory keepers hummed with protective energy, their stored moments of joy and peace radiating outward like shields. The active clocks pulsed with concentrated effort, trying to maintain local temporal coherence against the growing chaos. But their efforts were clearly failing. As Celeste watched, one of the smaller mantel clocks, a delicate piece that specialized in childhood memories, suddenly lurched backward through its own history. Its brass dimmed to raw metal, its careful engravings uncarved themselves, and for a terrifying moment, it existed as nothing more than a pile of component parts, before snapping back to its proper form, with a sound like breaking crystal. "The corruption is spreading through the temporal network," Mrs. Willoughby explained, her academic tone barely concealing her terror. "Each clock is connected to every other through invisible threads of time stuff. If the backward clock continues to grow stronger, it will eventually corrupt them all." A new voice joined their conversation, thin and reedy, like wind through broken glass. And then it whispered, "Everything will run backward. Every moment will unwrap itself. Every life will retrace its steps until nothing remains but the silence before creation." Celeste spun around, searching for the speaker, but found only empty air. Mrs. Willoughby's face had gone pale as winter sky. "The clock's spirits," she breathed. "They're beginning to manifest directly. That only happens when the danger is," she swallowed hard, "existential." The voice spoke again, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Keeper," it said, and the word carried the weight of desperate hope. "The binding weakens by the hour. Soon the barrier between forward and backward, between creation and uncreation, will collapse entirely. You must act, or time itself will die." Another voice joined the first, deeper, more resonant, like the tolling of cathedral bells. "But beware, young guardian, the corruption fights back. It seeks to drag all things into its backward spiral. To repair what has been broken, you must risk becoming broken yourself." A third voice, high and sweet as a child's laughter, added its warning. "The price of mending time may be your own place within it. Are you prepared for such a sacrifice?" Celeste felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her like physical force. 3 days ago, she had been an ordinary woman inheriting an unusual shop. Now the fate of time itself rested on her untrained shoulders. The temptation to flee, to leave this cosmic responsibility to someone more qualified, was almost overwhelming. But then she looked around at the shop her grandfather had built, at the clocks that had revealed their deepest secrets to her, at Mrs. Willoughby whose memories were being slowly stolen away, at the windows where innocent people moved through a world increasingly unmoored from temporal reality. This was her heritage, her calling, her burden to bear. "Tell me what I need to do," she said quietly. The clock spirit's response came not in words, but in a flood of images that crashed over her consciousness like a temporal tsunami. She saw Evangeline standing before the backward clock during its last corruption, her hands wreathed in silver light as she bound its chaotic energies. She witnessed the Great War's temporal catastrophe, entire battlefields where soldiers aged backward into children before dissolving into possibilities unrealized. She experienced the founding of the Keeper's bloodline, when the first guardian sacrificed everything to impose order on the primal chaos of unbound time. And threading through all these visions was a single terrible truth. Repairing the backward clock would require her to enter its temporal field directly, to synchronize her own life rhythms with its corrupted mechanisms. The process would either restore the binding or destroy her utterly. When the visions faded, Celeste found herself on her knees, Mrs. Willoughby's gentle hands supporting her shoulders. The older woman's face was etched with concern and something that might have been admiration. "You saw, didn't you?" Mrs. Willoughby asked softly. "You saw what needs to be done?" Celeste nodded, not trusting her voice. Around them, the shop clocks had fallen into an expectant silence, as if holding their collective breath. Even the sounds from the street had diminished, creating a pocket of unnatural quiet in the heart of the growing temporal storm. "There's something else," Mrs. Willoughby said, reaching into her coat pocket to withdraw a small silver pendant shaped like a clock face. Evangeline's journal mentioned this, a temporal anchor that can protect the keeper during the repair process. It won't guarantee safety, but it might keep you tethered to forward time long enough to complete the work. The pendant felt warm in Celeste's palm, its silver surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow even as she watched. She could feel protective energies radiating from it, not enough to shield her completely from the backward clock's influence, but perhaps sufficient to prevent total temporal dissolution. From the cellar came another of those reality-shredding chimes, stronger than before. This time the sound didn't fade but seemed to establish a permanent resonance that made the very air vibrate with wrongness. Several of the shop windows cracked spontaneously, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "Time is running out," one of the clock spirits observed with cosmic understatement. Mrs. Willoughby squeezed Celeste's hand. "Your grandfather believed in you," she said quietly. "The clocks chose you for this moment. And I've lived long enough to know real courage when I see it. Whatever happens down there, know that you're not facing it alone." Celeste stood slowly, the pendant's chains settling around her neck like a benediction. She could feel its protective influence spreading through her body, creating a buffer zone of stable time around her personal space. It wouldn't last long against the backward clock's corrupting power, but it might be enough. The clock spirits began to sing, if the harmonious chaos of temporal forces could be called singing. their voices weaving together into something that was equal parts lullaby and battle hymn. The shop clocks joined the chorus, their combined sound creating a sphere of reinforced reality that pushed back against the encroaching wrongness. "I'll need you to watch for signs of total temporal collapse," Celeste told Mrs. Willoughby as she prepared to descend once again into the cellar. "If the corruption spreads beyond the shop's boundaries, if it begins affecting the town's infrastructure, I'll do what I can," Mrs. Willoughby promised. "But Celeste, if the process begins to change you, if you start aging backward or forward too rapidly, you must stop. A broken universe isn't worth your life." Celeste smiled, though she suspected it looked more like a grimace. "Isn't it, though? What's one life against the existence of time itself?" As she descended the stairs for what might be the final time, the backward clock's malevolent presence grew stronger with each step. The air grew so thick with temporal distortion that it was like moving through honey, and the frost on the walls had spread to cover every surface in crystalline patterns that hurt to look at directly. The clock waited for her in its corner, its corrupted beauty terrible to behold. The pendulum's impossible motion had accelerated, and the hands now spun in directions that implied dimensions beyond the merely physical. Around its base, reality itself seemed to waver, as if the fundamental laws that governed existence were merely suggestions to be ignored at will. Celeste took a deep breath, perhaps her last in forward time, and stepped into the circle of the clock's influence. The world immediately turned inside out, and her journey into the heart of temporal chaos truly began. Chapter 4: Repairing Time and Memories. The moment Celeste stepped into the backward clock's sphere of influence, reality fractured like a mirror struck with a hammer. Time didn't merely flow backward around her. It twisted, spiraled, and folded in on itself, creating layers upon layers of temporal possibility. She experienced her entire life in reverse. The walk down the cellar stairs became a journey upward. Her childhood memories played in rewind, and for one terrifying instant, she felt herself dissolving into the potential that had existed before her birth. But Evangeline's pendant burned against her chest like a silver star, anchoring her to forward momentum even as chaos surrounded her. Through the maelstrom of corrupted time, she could see the clock's true nature, not merely a timepiece, but a wound in reality itself. The crystalline case wasn't made of any earthly material, but of condensed moments, and the backward-running numbers were scars where time had been torn and improperly mended. Her grandfather's tools, she realized with sudden clarity, would be useless here. This wasn't a mechanical repair, but something far more fundamental. A healing that required her to become one with the temporal forces she was trying to mend. Celeste closed her eyes and reached out with senses she hadn't known she possessed. The chaotic energies of the clock revealed themselves as a symphony of pain, discordant notes where the original binding had been damaged, harmonics that pulled in directions that shouldn't exist, rhythms that fought against the natural flow of causality. Beneath it all, she could sense the original purpose, a stabilizing force meant to keep local time from drifting too far from the universal current. "I can hear you," she whispered to the wounded mechanism. "I can feel where it hurts." The clock's response was immediate and overwhelming, a flood of images showing the damage's origin. A moment during the Great War when artillery shells had shaken the shop's foundation, jarring the delicate temporal bindings, decades of slow deterioration as the protective seals gradually weakened. Her grandfather's increasingly desperate attempts to contain the growing corruption, each failed effort leaving the binding more fragmented than before. But there was something else in the visions, a memory of the clock's creation, when Evangeline's great-grandmother had first bound these chaotic forces into stable form. The process had required not just technical skill, but a willingness to harmonize one's own life rhythms with the cosmic pulse of time itself. Celeste opened her eyes and saw the path forward with crystalline clarity. She needed to synchronize her heartbeat, her breathing, even her thoughts with the clock's corrupted rhythm, then gradually guide it back to proper alignment. It would mean merging temporarily with forces that could unmake her existence, but it was the only way to heal the fundamental damage. She placed her palms against the clock's crystalline surface and immediately felt her personal timeline begin to blur. Memories from her childhood became as vivid as the present moment. She could smell her grandmother's lavender soap, taste the apple tart from her 16th birthday, feel the rain from every storm she had ever experienced. But rather than losing herself in the temporal chaos, she used these memories as anchor points, creating a stable framework around which she could rebuild the clock's shattered binding. The work was unlike anything she had ever attempted. It was part precision clockmaking and part cosmic surgery, requiring her to manipulate forces that existed beyond the physical realm. She felt her consciousness expand to encompass not just the immediate present, but the flow of time through the entire shop, the town, the region. Through this expanded awareness, she could sense every place where the corruption had spread. Mrs. Willoughby's fading memories, the confused pedestrians outside, the temporal anomalies rippling outward like stones thrown in a pond. Gradually, painstakingly, she began to weave new bindings. Each repaired connection sent waves of relief through the temporal network, and she could hear the shop clocks above responding with harmonious chimes. The memory keepers hummed with renewed strength as their stored moments stabilized. The active clocks pulsed with cleaner energy as their temporal manipulations returned to precise calibration. But the deeper Celeste worked, the more she understood the true cost of the repair. The backward clock's original binding hadn't simply been damaged. It had been fundamentally altered by decades of corruption. To truly heal it would require not just mending the existing structure, but replacing its temporal core entirely. And there was only one source of uncorrupted temporal energy strong enough for such a replacement: her own life force. The realization came without shock or fear, settling into her consciousness with the gentle inevitability of sunrise. This was what the clock spirits had warned her about, the price that might be demanded. To save time itself, she would need to become part of the very mechanism she was repairing. From above, she heard Mrs. Willoughby's voice calling down the stairs. "Celeste, the effects are starting to reverse in town. People are moving normally again. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Celeste smiled even as silver tears traced down her cheeks. The pendant around her neck pulsed with warm light, not trying to prevent her sacrifice, but blessing it, recognizing the necessity and nobility of what she was about to do. But as she prepared to merge her essence with the clock's temporal core, she felt other presences joining her consciousness. every keeper who had come before, their accumulated wisdom and strength flowing into her through the generations of inherited responsibility. Evangeline was there, and her great-grandmother, and a line of guardians stretching back to the beginning of recorded time. "You are not alone in this," Evangeline's spirit whispered across the centuries. "We who came before will share the burden. Let us give what we can give." The ghostly keepers surrounded the backward clock with protective presence, their combined essence creating a buffer that would allow Celeste to merge with the temporal mechanism without being entirely consumed by it. She would still pay a price. Part of her would forever remain bound to the shop's temporal network, but she would survive to continue her duties as guardian and protector. With infinite care, Celeste began the final phase of the repair. She felt her consciousness divide, part remaining in her physical form, while another portion flowed into the clock's crystalline matrix. The sensation was like dissolving into music, becoming both the instrument and the melody it played. She was simultaneously herself and something infinitely larger, a node in the cosmic network that kept time flowing smoothly throughout the world. The backward clock's tortured chiming gradually transformed into something beautiful, a pure, clear note that resonated through every temporal frequency. The crystalline case brightened to diamond radiance before settling into a gentle, steady glow. The impossible pendulum found its proper rhythm, swinging with clockwork precision that brought order to the chaos around it. When the work was finally complete, Celeste found herself back in her own body, though forever changed. She could feel the shop's entire temporal network as part of her extended senses, could hear the conversations between clocks as clearly as if they spoke aloud. The backward clock now hummed with contentment, its corruption healed, and its bindings stronger than ever. Mrs. Willoughby's footsteps on the stairs announced the older woman's careful descent. She found Celeste sitting beside the restored clock, both of them glowing softly with temporal energy. "You did it," Mrs. Willoughby breathed, wonder in her voice. "I can feel my memories coming back. My husband's face, our anniversary last year, the breakfast we shared the morning before he passed. Everything is returning to its proper place in time." Celeste nodded, too weary for words. The repair was complete, but she understood now that her journey as keeper had only just begun. The clocks throughout the shop were her family now, their constant presence a comfort and responsibility that would last for the rest of her days. And somewhere in the future, when her time as guardian ended, she would train another young woman to take her place in the endless cycle of protection and care. The afternoon light slanting through the cellar windows seemed warmer now, touched with gold that spoke of seasons turning in their proper order. Above them, the shop's clocks sang their eternal song of moments measured and memories preserved, while time itself flowed safely forward toward whatever wonders tomorrow might bring. In the crystalline depths of the restored clock, Celeste's reflection smiled back at her, part human, part temporal guardian, wholly committed to the sacred trust that had been passed down through generations of keepers. Time was safe once more, and that was all that truly mattered. The clockmaker's daughter had come into her inheritance at last.